Hi, my name is Neil Blackadder. I'm going to be reading from my translation of Sanderling by Anne Weber, which was published by Indigo Books in the UK. It appeared there in November, and it's been available in the US since February. Um, Anne Weber is a German writer who's been living in France, in Paris, for most of her life. She was born in 1964. She first went there as a young woman to be an au pair. And she's unusual in that she writes in both languages and translates between both languages. She's an accomplished and award-winning translator from German into French and French into German. And at some point, she started writing her own books, which she sometimes writes first in French and then writes translated into German, sometimes the other way around. With this book, she wrote it in German and then prepared a French version. Sanderling tells the story or explores the life of her own great grandfather. It's a non-fiction book, but written in a very literary style. It bears the subtitle in the German Zeitreise-Tagebuch, which is to say, Chronicle of a Journey Through Time. In it, she explores the life of her great grandfather, Florenz Christian Rang, who was many things in the course of his life. He was a Protestant pastor, he was a civil servant, but more importantly, really, he was a writer and a thinker. And he became friends with Walter Benjamin and Martin Buber, Hugo von Hofmannsthal. So he moved in those kinds of cultural, intellectual circles. And Sanderling is the nickname that Anne gave to her grandfather, her great grandfather, which is explained in this first passage I'm going to read, which is the very opening couple of pages from the book. It begins with my username, which is Panzerdivision. I chose it years ago when I first applied for a card to access the lower level of the Bibliothèque Nationale, open only to researchers. To reserve a seat and to order books online, you need a pseudonym. I could, of course, have chosen something like nasturtium or silkworm. I had chosen Panzerdivision. That was the nickname once bestowed upon me by an exceptionally charming Frenchman who was second to none in the refined art of irony, an art that has more recently fallen in my estimation. It should be pronounced as nasally as possible, with a soft S and the stress on the final syllable, Panzerdivision. At the time, this nickname, which I had earned not only because I am German, but also because of certain personal traits that were, and presumably still are, typical of me, struck me as funny. In the context of the research I plan to carry out with the aid of this username, it no longer sounds so funny. The focus of that research will be a German who spent some years in Poland, my great-grandfather. To make it clear from the outset, my great-grandfather didn't invade Poland. The region around Poznan, where he lived, had been annexed by Prussia as early as 1815. Still, I'd like to change my library pseudonym. It's not possible. As the grumpy woman in charge of issuing library cards explains to me, once you've chosen a username, a so-called alias, it lasts forever. Panzerdivision. It's the same with this nickname as with the past itself. Everyone knows you can't run away from it. And it seems to be true. You can move, like I did, to a foreign country, settle there, learn to speak and write the language so that, sometimes at least, people mistake you for one of the locals. You think you can disappear. But regardless of where you go and how long you've lived in a foreign country, everyone there already saw your wanted poster, and they're laughing or smiling at you. Panzerdivision. So the username remains in place. And in the end, I can't rule out the possibility that the book I want to dedicate to my great-grandfather will sooner or later be invaded by Germans. I'm going to start by also giving him a kind of nickname or username, since I don't want to constantly be writing my great-grandfather. which after all isn't his most important role in life, nor his full name, Florenz Christian Rang, nor Florenz Christian, which is what I always heard from my father's side of the family, where he's treated with respectful familiarity, let alone our hero, which I don't like in either an ironic or an actual sense. FCR, like JFK, would be concise and practical, but definitely makes you think too readily of a football club. So, what username would I choose if I had to apply for a Bibliothèque Nationale card for him today? Plenty of words would apply to him: seeker, maniac, radical, malcontent, rebel. But what I'm looking for is a name, a password. I choose after a bird I've often seen on the French coast running back and forth following the surf, the name Sanderling. I want to talk a little before I read more about my process in translating this book. The original German had the title Ahnen, which is a word with a double meaning. Ahnen means both ancestors or forefathers, which obviously is the sort of uh, most obvious meaning, and that's what she's exploring in the book. But Ahnen also means to have a suspicion or an inkling about something. So there is that double play. The French version was given the title Vaterland, the German word Vaterland, or as Anne explains, it gets pronounced by the French something more like Vaterland, um, which is a title I don't think Anne was all that keen on, but the French publishers really wanted a title that would immediately indicate the fact that the book deals with German history. Um, we plumped for the title Sanderling, and the um, I haven't yet explained how it deals with German history, which I will get into in the second reading. Um, Anne explores the generations of her family and what happened in the generation immediately following Sanderling's own. His own son became an ardent Nazi, and that, in some ways, is the kind of core of the book or of what she's exploring. Um, how did someone who embodied the best of humanist values and self-examination and self-exploration, how did a man like that manage to father a man who would give himself over to the worst excesses of totalitarianism under the Third Reich? Um, and then there's another generation, which is Anne's father, who's about to appear in the second part. I'll read. Um, his attitude was to not be pleased that Anne was exploring the family history, um, finding out about his father, her grandfather. Another element is that, as you might have figured out from the name, Anne does not have the name of her great grandfather because she was born illegitimately. So there's a lot of complicated stuff that goes on goes into the family drama and the different generations. Um, I also wanted to talk a little bit about my what I like Tess Lewis, who translated the other book by Anne that's been translated into English, which in English is called Epic Annette. It's the German book Annette, based on the life of a real remarkable woman who was a resistance fighter and other things. Anyway, both Tess and I translated these books in what we call a triangular way, where we consider both the German and the French originals. Because when Anne prepares a second version of her books, she doesn't necessarily call it a translation. It's more like she wrote Ahnen in German, and then she wrote Vaterland, basing it heavily, obviously, on the German. But along the way, she sometimes changes her mind. She sometimes removes a sentence. She sometimes adds a sentence. So I based my translation on both the German and the French. And sometimes the French help me to understand the German, because obviously in translation there's often a word could have two possible meanings. And the French could sometimes help me to figure out sort of exactly what she meant when she used that word in the German. Um, I find that a fascinating process, and as someone who translates from both languages, it was a great opportunity. I'm now going to read another passage from later in the book. My father told me how he's also still tormented by the idea that in 1944 his parents moved into an apartment in Bielefeld that was directly above the offices of the Secret Service for the SS in Grünstrasse. An apartment like that would only have been assigned to someone the regime could trust, and only a faithful party member would have accepted it. Receiving visits from dissidents in this building was inconceivable. But what dissidents could have visited anyway? The Jewish friends had emigrated a long time ago. Benjamin had already taken his own life. I look at my father, sitting there sunk into himself, in his Ames lounge chair, designed in 1956, one specimen of which is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, another in my father's living room. I see a man who's now old, indeed in his dotage, with all the humiliating frailty he tries to hide, and which, it seems to me, has brought him closer to me. And two feelings are alive in me at once. The first being my distress over the fact that he is permanently right on the edge of the abyss, that for some time now his existence has seemed to be hanging by a thread. When he gets up and walks a few steps, it seems as if he might collapse any minute, and I'm on the alert, ready to jump up and catch him. He refuses to use a cane. As for the device on wheels that you push in front of yourself, he hasn't so much as uttered its name. And at the same time, there's also something else. The awful thought occurs to me that of all the things from the past that weigh upon him, what might well hurt the most is the banal and vulgar fact of having had a Nazi for a father, and that this might also be at the root of his silence. By talking to me and perhaps to others close to him, he's opened a hairline crack in this vault of silence. He tells me he's always been afraid that one day someone will make all this public. He says this to me, the only person in his family who regularly makes anything public, that is, who writes and publishes books. I hope that the two excerpts I've read have given you a sense of this admirable and extremely well-written book. I might mention that Anna's journey to Poland takes her to various places having to do with some of the worst things that happened in Poland, also to places where her great-grandfather lived, where she explores episodes that he wrote about in his journal, and she's constantly piecing together what she finds out in those places and meditating on how she feels about what she's finding out and what it means to her that her great-grandfather wrote these things and said these things, and she's sort of putting things up against each other. But the book actually ends in a scene at a festival for the dead that happens in Poland, which ends up being at the end of a book that is obviously deals with some pretty dark material. The closing passage that takes place at this festival, this ritual in Poland involving lots of people going to visit the graves of their relatives. It's actually an extremely moving ending. So obviously, I highly recommend this book, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity to read from it as part of the San Jordi Festival. Thanks.